Greetings. I'd like to welcome everyone in our audience today. We are very grateful that you have chosen to share some of your busy day with us. We know your time is valuable, and we will honor that today with what I'm confident will be an engaging discussion. Once again, our topic is your approach to authentication killing your growth? Learn how to enable safe growth in a zero-trust world. Our sponsor today is Alloy. Our host today is American Banker. My name is Mike Sisk. I'm a contributing editor at American Banker, and I will be your moderator today. And I am very, very pleased to introduce our two speakers. We have with us Warren Jones. Warren leads fraud strategy and analytics for Santander US, where he is responsible for defining, implementing, and maintaining a preventative fraud strategy that enables the broader bank transformation and strategic line of business plans to succeed. And we're very delighted to have Warren here with us today. And also we have Sarah Seguin. Sarah is the principal advisor on fraud and identity risk at Alloy, a leading identity decisioning platform. She has deep-rooted experience within various fraud risk domains, including deposits, payments, online activity, cards, risk, and identity. And we're also delighted to have Sarah with us today. And just before I turn things over, a couple quick housekeeping notes that were in that video, but I just want to kind of reiterate. We do have some time at the end for Q&A today. Usually you have 10 minutes or so. And you can submit your questions through the Google form that's available in the related content in the module that you've got today. So please, we very much encourage you to get those questions in there throughout the hour as they occur to you. If you ask a question that we don't get to today, we'll definitely follow up after the program. So please ask away. We very much want to hear from you. And we also have a couple polls, and I always encourage 100% participation. I rarely get it, but it's a great way for everyone to see where other folks stand on the issue and come together to discuss. So if you can weigh in on the polls, that'd be fantastic. Okay, so I think that kind of brings me to the end of my little opening spiel here. I would now like to turn things officially over to Sarah. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. And thanks everyone for being here. So we'll do a quick run through of the agenda. We will start with the new growth imperative. So what we're seeing in some of our recent surveys and what does that mean to the industry. We will move into the evolution of authentication. It has come a long way over the past few decades. So we'll take a look at that and where there are challenges and where a lot of folks are at in current state. And then we'll move into what good looks like. So we talk a lot about the problems, but ultimately, where do we go from here? And what should folks be looking at, keep a pulse point on, and how can they really mesh that into their existing strategy? And then the goal is to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So with that, let's dive right in. So with the new growth imperative, one of the things that we understand is that fraud has really crossed a threshold, right? So, it is no longer just the most dangerous, elaborate, largest attacks. It is really now the fastest to adapt. So what we know about fraudsters is they continue to adapt very quickly. There are a lot of different themes out there, whether it's polymorphic, where as quickly as your models are, trained and you can even test new ones, the fraudsters are equally doing the same, and they are very quick to adapt to your models, right? So when we look at a stat based from 2024, that automated traffic surpassed human activity. That was 2 years ago, but pretty substantial, right? So we start to think about, well, where are we at now? What will the stat be in 2027? So Warren, would love to know from you, we hear this automated traffic. We know that they're between firewalls and cyber teams and authentication teams, fraud teams. What do you think across organizations? Do you find that many have awareness of their own visibility on what percentage of traffic is automated? Do they lack visibility? What are the challenges there?
Likely each area has a good grasp and understanding of what automated traffic is. You mentioned some infosec, cyber, digital, fraud. There's a slice of good automated traffic as well as the malicious. There's aggregators, financial aggregators. We're about to experience agentic AI agents that can be both genuine, initiated by a human or a consumer, and malicious. So likely across the organization or the enterprise, it may not be well understood or reported what the total volume of automated traffic is, both the good and the bad. So we're looking at, how the automated approaches are shifting and adapting is, a blend of not only the automated, but also automated supported by manual or human intervention. So when you look across those lenses of cyber fraud, digital, the automated attacks or the automated traffic, that's often needed human assistance as well to get by some of the layers of security and controls which digital first organizations are standing up.
Warren, you bring up a really great point about the good traffic, right? So often in the fraud sector, we think about the bad traffic that's coming through and how do we thwart that. But equally as important is the good traffic that you want to make sure that you let in. And I hear you. It's definitely the balance between how you are monitoring, how you are intervening, or letting the good traffic pass through. So we're, top of mind, we've heard a lot of folks talk about recently the polymorphic fraud and the quick adapting attacks. I'm hearing you, right? There's still automation, but some require the manual components. When we think about some of the themes and, fraud things that you are seeing, what is the most creative, fastest adapting attack that you have seen? Let's say maybe within the last 6 months, within the last year, that has actually made you rethink perhaps your strategy, your assumptions.
It's kind of the fraud manufacturing or fraud working as an organized business or entity. The globalization of fraud that has, been able to occur due to the digitalization of just e-commerce in general. We've seen fraud across the industry become more of an organized type of legal entity type of operation. And so often you're seeing fraudsters almost work a 9 to 5. And that's where there's some automation supported by, the manual intervention, whether it's attempting a scam against a consumer or whether it's actually providing an identity document, and those sorts of things. So it's kind of some of the newer age fraud that is working in a more organized fashion, supported by automation, of course.
Yes. So I want to lean in. There's one thing that I love that you said is fraud operating as its own entity when we think about the attackers, right? So really thinking about whether it's the fraudsters and this is their 9 to 5. Some of them literally go to their job of being a scammer and completing that between certain hours and working shifts, and really to keep that in mind as defenses and strategies are built. So let's take a look at, we have 2 different surveys that Alloy put out. These stats are from a combination of both. So just a little bit of background, Alloy does a state of fraud report where we survey over 500 fraud leaders from financial institutions similar to yourself. So whether it is fintech, credit union, mid-market banks, enterprise banks. So wide range, but to understand the challenges that they face and where they are going to focus on in the future. But then we also surveyed consumers because, it's really important to understand where peers and other institutions are at, but equally as important in how consumers really face the challenges and the threats and what they're looking for in a financial institution. So, we have 2 stats here, but what became abundantly clear is that consumers, we start to lean into authentication. Authentication is fraud prevention. They don't think to themselves, okay, wonder who's going to handle this for me. Wonder who's going to stop the fraud. Is it the authentication team at the financial institution or is it the fraud team? To them, it's really about the protection and ensuring that they are trusted there, right? To be protected and their assets protected from loss. So 97% of consumers indicated that fraud prevention and security measures was a top factor when selecting their financial institution. But equally as important, 79% reported that strong fraud prevention also increases their willingness to purchase more. So now we're deepening the relationship, into a true relationship type client. So Warren, let's dig into that first one because, I read this and the first thing I think about is, how is a consumer evaluating a tech stack, right, from a financial institution? So, it leads me to believe that they are equating that the fraud protection is more of the experience, right? Maybe not necessarily evaluating the fraud stack that an institution is using, but it is their experience. How does it feel? What is their experience? How do they feel protected? What do you think about how that translates?
It goes beyond just the dollars and cents in your checking your savings account, or your credit card, information that can be used for a purchase. I think that really consumers are selecting their financial institution because they're trusting them with their personal information, their data, where they're shopping and who they're sharing money with and moving money to, where they live and reside. There's a lot of secure, sensitive information that you share with your financial institution. So it goes beyond just the assets, the monetary assets they might trust with you, that you might have liability for, zero fraud liability or something like that for your customers in place. So it's not surprising to see 97%. The other 3%, maybe they read the survey wrong, because it probably is closer to 100% nowadays, especially where, I think a lot of us as consumers, as people, we see the fraud happening. We're victims of either identity theft or a data compromise or a scam attempt, a robocall, a robo text message. So I think everyone's really does take it serious, and that goes into kind of the next point as well, and what you mentioned about evaluating a technology stack. I think that where financial institutions can share more information with the customer themselves or the consumer, so that they can take security in their own hands, whether it's managing their own devices or their own account linkages, or giving them really strong notifications of some risk signals that you're picking up on or detecting. I think that goes a long way as well to kind of demonstrating some of the controls that you may have or security that you may have in place.
Yeah, absolutely. All very good points, Warren, because then it makes me think, so if consumers are starting to choose, right, their banks, and based on many of the things that you listed that they are experiencing, then how does that lean into, and what does that mean for financial institutions as far as like the proactive investment? What we know is that year over year investments are made into fraud and identity, right? And certainly authentication as well, but those investments vary. And what we still hear from a lot of financial institutions is that even though they are trying to be proactive, they are still reactive, right? And that is for many of them. So, do you think that in how consumers are building and shopping for bank accounts, et cetera, do you think that will really change into how financial institutions are making their proactive investments into the infrastructure, because they realize that it starts to have a true sales growth advantage, not just reduction in losses?
1,000%. When we're setting our fraud strategy, and a lot of it is enabling bank transformation, business growth, and strategic planning, providing a desired customer experience or way to go about developing and building and putting a product to market. So when you're looking at fraud management, it can be a business enabler, or lead to more efficiencies in a back office through automation, through having preventative controls and defenses in place. So when looking at that investment and going forward with that investment, you can usually find an ROI in enhancing your fraud controls and technologies, but there's also that growth perspective, that customer first perspective as well, that I think is important.
Well, very well said, Warren. I think that's definitely 100% true. What I do want to lean into is, where, and Warren, you said it earlier, right? And that was related to when we start to think about the automation and what is coming in from traffic, but there are still, when you think about how some banks still operate, that most FIs operate fraud, identity auth, and tech as three different components, right? But then you think from the attacker perspective, and they're coordinated, right? They don't have to worry about, this group, down the hall is working on, attacking call centers. This other group is working on attacking digital. I mean, they really operate as a coordinated system across all. So if we just look at login, session, transaction, operating across all three. Liminal wrote a really interesting paper about the convergence of fraud and authentication, right? And we have started to see this as well, in that fraud and auth historically years ago was completely independent of one another, but now the two are really being brought together, because if you don't have a strong authentication program, what happens on the back end? Losses, fraud, etc. So, when we start to think about the current state, some of the current state and what that problem is, Warren, what do you think the true structural reason that some of these are viewed as three separate components in today's environment?
The structural reason is there's different levels of talent or skill set or experience in these roles. I think you have your technologists that might develop software or implement and code. You have your fraud teams that might understand tools, technologies, risk, your identity and auth, which is, managing permission-based authorizations or customer experience and allowing access to a session. There's a bit of a nuance in each. Now, structurally as well, why FIs and other entities might operate as three, the underlying foundational issue would be with the data. So making sure you can bring, the data downstream together and have what you're collecting through these layers of where, there's a web session interacting with your infrastructure, your channel, or where there's a customer interacting with your customer, your channel. Having the data layers so that you can effectively orchestrate that and run some dynamic risk-based authentication or authorization, or even product type functionality and capability, such as a limit, such as a payment offering, be able to orchestrate that and run that through a risk-based lens. I think that helps with efficiencies, that helps with scalability and growth. So some of the foundational layers, I think conceptually, there's like different skill sets and talents in these pillars, but what might keep them siloed as well or prevent them from working more homogeneously together is the data at the end of the day and the use of that data.
Yeah. Which, Warren, we know data is power, right? And the more data you can have access to, certainly across those layers, it will make each of those benefit really all three. And you're right, there's a risk-based lens to each one of those. And so how do we get them to align, which leads into, we talked about current state. We know it's hard, but if we move to future state and what this could look like, we also know that there's different leaders across all three. So you're right, organizationally, those groups are separated. There is definitely different talent. There is access. There are data components. But if folks wanted to start to make a change, what do you think about, is this a tech problem? Is it an org issue? In addition to the talent, the items you mentioned, who can lead the charge on starting to make a change there in bringing really these various layers together, specifically from a fraud and auth perspective? But Warren, I would also ask you, then what do you think is the hardest piece, right? So who should lead the charge, and where are the landmines? What is the hardest piece to stitch together?
Well, not to shift accountability from an area not on the page, but at the end of the day, the customer or the business line or the product owner, like that's what's driving revenue for the firm. That's who owns the P&L, who owns the risk. Some of these areas are support functions, and yes, we own controls and processes, but they're all there to support the inherent risk that's generated by the products that we operate and offer, the customer base that we have. So who could be the champion? Perhaps it's the business line. Because at the end of the day, if we get these things right, it will help them scale, and it'll help them scale and grow in an efficient, secure, safe manner. So maybe since they're not well represented in the three, we can push it to them.
I mean, hey, when folks aren't there, right? That is usually the one who ends up with the action items. So we all know that from meetings. No, that's great. So hey, let's dive into our first poll. So Mike, I am going to turn it back to you for our first poll.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. All right, everyone. Yes, we're going to put up our first poll here. And basically, I'm just going to read through the question and the answers, and hopefully that gives everyone enough time to weigh in here. So question is, which of the following authentication challenges is most painful for your organization today? Is it too much friction causing abandonment or call center volume? Or siloed systems, digital branch or call centers don't share context? Is it hard-coded rules that require engineering sprints to change? Or fraud exploiting gaps between systems and channels? And so there you have it again. Which of the following authentication challenges is most painful for your organization today? I'll just hold it open for another couple of moments here. I've got a nice little tool that lets me see how many folks are participating. So I like to hold things open until we've got a nice percentage here representative of our group today. And it is actually, that's a really nice number of folks participating. Really appreciate all these votes. Or votes, ballots, not quite sure what they are. Opinions. Here we go. I'm going to share right now. Alrighty. Okay, so siloed systems with digital branch and call centers don't share context, 39%, and that was tied with fraud exploiting gaps between systems and channels, another 39%. So you've pretty much you've got the lion's share right there. So Sarah, let me just kick it over to you. Are these kind of in line with what you would expect to see, or any surprises here?
Yeah, it is definitely in line. I did not expect those to, I expected them to be towards the top, but not necessarily tie with one another. So I do find that interesting. And I actually thought that hard-coded rules would be a little higher than the 7% there. But I think, overall, it aligns to what we're hearing as well, is that when these three groups, and we can add in more, right? But when groups are operating in silos, then it means they're not sharing context, they're not sharing historical data. At times, they may have a siloed view of the customer, and whenever they're coming in from an authentication perspective. And so, Warren, would love to hear your thought as well. Is this kind of what you thought on how it would play out?
My mind always jumps to seeing these problems, like jumps to how can we fix it or what could the solution be, and just seeing how this waterfalls down a bit. If we can address siloed systems, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and kind of having that data in a common area and being able to use it in a dynamic or orchestrated risk-based manner. If we can fix siloed systems, it almost will help address the fraud exploit gap across systems and controls. It would likely help reduce some friction in certain areas. So siloed systems seems to be like kind of the root cause as well of potentially some of these other challenges that we're facing.
That's a great call, Warren, right? Because a lot of them are interconnected, even from us. If they're siloed, you start to fix certain things. It then has this great organic process to fix others. So continuing on from an, evolution and the reality that financial institutions face today. So we'll dig in here before we outline, what is really starting to kill your growth. So some of the challenges, I won't read all of them, but what really catches my eye that we know continues to be a challenge is balancing the consumers' expectations and really the right amount and or no consumer friction, and how we really take what the customer is looking for and turn that into a reality for them. We start to think about their expectations are easy to do business, and if they can do it in the branch, can they do it online as well? So Warren, high level, but from this list, what garners really the most attention with an organization? Is it the always customer at the front? Is it the high fraud rates? Does it change based on, ebb and flow based on where an institution is at? What do you think?
It's likely customer at the end of the day. The customer is always right. That old adage, without customers, you're not really in business. So, I think top two that continuously generate most of the attention is, having that product that's competitive, that's easy, simple to use and understand, hit some of those expectations, and also balancing the friction with the risk management of the product itself. So it does seem to always come back to customer.
At the end of the day, right? It always comes back. Yep. So when we think about the auth mistakes that are killing your growth, right? So this is definitely not an all-inclusive list. So a little bit of a disclaimer, but this is what we are hearing time and time again, especially as of late. And so I do want to take some time to dive into each one. Warren, what we are hearing still exists today is treating every user the same. So whether it is the riskiest user coming in, the most loyal customer coming in, a lot of times they're hitting the same login flow. So why is it still built that way? And then what breaks once you start to differentiate?
It's still built that way because of that zero trust mentality, especially in cybersecurity, in authentication in general. So that's why, every account opening event or every login or session creation is treated the same way because of zero trust. I think where you can get it right, and to that prior page, hit the customer targets, hit the revenue targets, hit your fraud targets, is when you've established trust and you've authenticated that user, having the dynamic or risk-based abilities to maybe dictate the permissions or the authorizations during a session, evaluate risk during a session, which can change as well after that is authenticated and you've moved past that zero trust. So I think it goes back to zero trust, why it's still treated the same.
Yeah, and Warren, you just said something that actually leads us right into the next item, which is point in time checks only at login are still taking place, right? So we know that login is only one piece. And so the session and beyond, right, the full picture, and you called it out, that it really is what else is happening within that session. And anything else that you would add on that notion? I think, 1 and 2 start to flow into one another, but maybe I would ask, is this a tech limitation? Is this a vendor limitation that the point in time checks still exist?
It's neither. It's, where we're at today with fraud management. We've done a great job over the last however many years and we're going to get into this, of improving authentication, improving the way we do multi-factor, moving off of static knowledge base all the way to OTPs, device printing, and now behavior or biometrics. So what that's left is like the customer being vulnerable or the customer being the weakest link. If the fraudster, the attacker, can't bypass the authentication themselves, they might target the customer with scams or with some, direct to customer assisted type of account takeover. So you'll see that happening after login. you might see the customer log in on their device, or someone applying for an account and bringing in a deposit with their own identity. And it's kind of after the fact, throughout the relationship or through that session, where I think, well, I answered the question neither. It's just that the frauds change, the external environments change, the risk vectors are evolving. So we need to set our strategic planning around that, so that the infrastructure, the controls, that follows suit.
You're right. Continue to adapt, right? It isn't just, what you put in place 3 years ago is still going to work.
Exactly
So
right.
a lot of the times we hear about rules being buried in your SIAM and how some institutions are challenged with that. I mean, listen, SIAM, identity platform, both are required for a really good, robust program, right? But when we think about fraud logic living inside SIAM, and that's what we're hearing is really a challenge. And the reason we're hearing it's a challenge is because teams are then unable to see test quickly change without a formal request. What would you say the cost there is as it relates to response and threat time?
It can be heavy. So your SIAM needs to also be evolving, with the way that customers want to be authenticated. What do you know about your customer and how they're typically interacting with your channel to authenticate them to the highest level, that they're able to receive that form of multi-factor. If the SIAM requires lengthy development time, testing time, to change a rule or to change a policy or to integrate with another control provider, that can materially impede your response time. So having the ability for your SIAM to work with some way to orchestrate data from your core, from your security environment, from the different layers of controls that are assessing risk of your customer or the session, is extremely important, just to keep up with the way that the fraud landscape is evolving.
Couldn't agree more. And when we look at four, we just heard this in the poll. We heard 39% of folks say that yes, siloed signals across channels are a problem, right? So if a customer is failing authentication when they are speaking to the contact center, then they immediately try to log into online banking through the web. Some of those channels are not receiving the signals from one another, which makes it incredibly difficult to have a really robust strategy there. And the last one here is the vendor lock-in masquerading as a stack. This is an interesting take because, from our perspective, we see a platform, it should be flexible and it should scale and, really even address the threats you haven't seen yet. Because, Warren, and so do other folks on the call, what we know today is a threat is probably going to be different than a few weeks. Heck, even maybe a few days, right, from now, because the threats are evolving. So, what we see is that the stacks that are being created, is it a way to make it more expensive to leave? Or what else is it? And how could leaders tell the difference between the two? Because we do hear this lock-in really becoming a challenge in the industry.
There's certainly, a lot of great technology providers, a lot of innovative entities that, are evolving, and moving at scale along with the adversaries. It's interesting because the fraudsters, they don't have to operate by the letter of the law. They don't have to follow model governance. So they often, we find them one or two steps ahead sometimes. So the way that, the technology is evolving so quickly, you might not be able to bind yourself to just one provider. There might be one provider that is the best in breed today, but not tomorrow. But 2 years from now, they will be again when their R&D or their control catches up. So having the ability to implement and tailor and configure the right technology providers, the right aggregation of data that's available for risk programs. It's very important because it allows you to adapt and evolve a bit more dynamically, a bit more agile, versus hitching your wagon to like a single, it creates a concentration risk if you're, selecting just kind of one provider to operate with, and also business continuity. If there's one provider that is failing to meet their service levels or provide that service, then all of a sudden your business slows down, your business is impacted. We're in that customer business, so we can't afford that.
And you're spot on. You can't afford to stall or stop that growth. And when the line of business says, hey, we want to launch a new product in 3 months, you want to be able, from a fraud perspective, to say, I have a wealth of controls that I can pull and be ready in 3 months for you to launch, yep. Right, as well, and really help the shareholder value there. Okay, so we talked a lot about the challenges that we're facing and what we're hearing in the market, some of the pieces of what is really stalling growth. But now let's turn to what does good look like. So actually, Mike, I'm going to flip it back over to you for our second poll.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. So yes, everyone, this is our second poll, same drill as before. I'm going to read through the question and the answers here, and please take that time to weigh in. So how would you describe your current authentication strategy? Is it reactive? We add controls when a new threat emerges. Functional but fragmented, different rules and vendors by channel. Partially unified, we've made progress but still have gaps. Or it's fully risk-based, continuous omni-channel with dynamic decisioning. So very good. Again, how would you describe your current authentication strategy? Excellent, thanks. See good participation here. Just a reminder to, if you've got a question, we've got some time at the end. So please use that Google link to send us some questions. Would love to get to them in the time we've got here. And even if we run out of time, we'll definitely follow up and answer any question you have. So please do ask away. Okay, very good. Looks like we got a nice percentage of participation here. Let me go ahead and share. I'll share it right now. Okay. So leading the pack here, 35% said functional but fragmented with different rules and vendors by channel, followed by reactive, 28%, partially unified, 26%, only 11% said fully risk-based. I see you sort of nodding your head, Sarah. Is this kind of what you were expecting?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, Mike, I was thinking that functional but fragmented would definitely be leading the pack there, because what I see is a lot of institutions that they may look to become centralized and fraud to be run as a centralized function, but that's a journey, right? And there are certainly benefits to having it as centralized, but we still see that a lot of different groups across the bank have the vendors they're used to working with, vendors that really are niche for what they do. And so that definitely makes sense to me. I love still seeing the 11% at the fully risk-based. That's fantastic. And great to see that over 10%. Warren, want to give you a chance to weigh in on your thoughts as well.
A lot of honest attendees today, so appreciate that.
Love it.
I think with fraud as well, and authentication, no matter how mature you are, you need to really maintain that. So you could be, partially unified or even potentially fully risk-based today. And if you're not updating your technologies and maintaining that investment, you can become, a laggard or functional but fragmented over time. So it's important just to continuously maintaining your defenses.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think about the being able to continuously maintain, We are still seeing this authentication maturity curve. So Warren nailed it. Thank you for the honesty from the group here today. We see this maturity. So those who have been in the industry a long time, you all have seen as well where, a long time ago, password was, just tried and true. Dare I say silver bullet, right? But that is really where the industry leaned in, was password. And then there was a time of KBA as well. And then we went to blanket MFA and, all the way to that, what was the 11%, that continuous contextual probabilistic, the really role-based authentication. Uh, There's a curve here, but what I would say that we see most often is that it's a combination. So, there are still institutions that are using KBA and a combination where it's password KBA at times, but SMS OTP blanket for all and even multiple times within one session. We're just seeing a variety here coming off of this page. So we've lived through it. Warren, I want to dig in a little bit to the KBA component because we are still seeing a lot of institutions that are using it and using it as a fallback as well. Why do you think that is, that KBA is still being relied on?
It's likely due to the needed infrastructure investment or upgrade. The old kind of tale is that KBA is really the means that majority of customers can authenticate and gain access to that session or channel, just based on the sheer relative data of an amount of PII that's been compromised. The KBA is no longer truly an effective control. I think where you're using KBA for authentication, if you're doing that with a risk-based authorization approach, where maybe you allow a password in KBA to view certain information, such as get balances through your call center or view some information through a digital channel, that's okay. If you're going to move into actual performing some banking activity, maintenance, money movements, see sensitive information in the channel, that's where you got to step up those permissions, step up the level of authorization that the authenticated user has. So, why are folks still using KBA? It's probably the need for an investment upgrade. The barrier to entry might be customer, but there's certainly other ways to do dynamic, and secure, effective ways to do dynamic multi-factor beyond asking knowledge-based questions. There are folks that have a mobile phone or a landline or, are on a browser that, there's just a number of ways to do a more secure multi-factor nowadays. So.
Yeah, and really shifting from, the static and moving to the dynamic, because it's similar, Warren, we could say everything you shared with KBA, it's similar to SMS, right? OTP as well. While really good at one point and then it was heavily adopted, it now causes friction because it's used time and time again. It's deployed, and we know that fraudsters can compromise it even post that point in time check, right? So it's along the path of maturity, but again, there is additional dynamic ways to really start to think, to move over to the risk-based for a true experience that would help the consumer. So we go all the way over to the right, risk-based authentication. We can all agree this is not new. This is not a new concept. Risk-based authentication has been around for some time. But, it just still seems that it is not heavily adopted, right? So we saw that 11% from the poll. So, Warren, with that, can you talk through some of the ways that, RBA, the discussions, are you seeing a resurgence, organizations looking to make that change, specifically to move all the way over to RBA?
Yeah, it's definitely a main topic of discussion. I think why it's not heavily adopted so far is it is hard to do. It's, a heavy investment. It's a lengthy project. It often changes the way customers are used to transacting or interacting with your organization. A lot of change management with your customer facing frontline teams in the call center or retail network or what have you. So it truly is an enterprise program to do risk-based authentication. I think, again, to sell it, it's can make the product easier for the customer. You can do RBA to actually reduce friction, give positive friction, inform the customer of risk signals you're detecting in that session, and make them aware of what's going on. So approaching it with your product partners, your business line partners, to actually improve the usability of your product or your channel, the experience of the customer, reduce customers calling in or visiting a branch, which can help you save on overhead and things of that nature. Approaching it from more than just a fraud loss mitigation will probably help organizations secure that investment, but it is hard to do. It's hard to implement, it's hard to maintain. So that's likely why it's not as widely adopted as we'd like to see.
Yeah, and I oftentimes think too that sometimes it's thought of as a full rip and replace, right? That there has to be this full rip and replace of the existing and move to the new. And you can do the crawl, walk, run, as we fondly say in banking, and really go to the MVP of what is minimally viable that you can start now and then start to weave in, so that you can gain benefits faster, and maybe a more adaptable segment of your consumer base that it would be best to start with, et cetera. So if we lean into how do we really raise the bar here? So if I just had to pick two to focus on, right, I would look at the multi-signal and the continuous risk assessment. Now, the other two are equally as important, but we'll just dive into the first two today. Truly, when you start to think about, you don't just need noise. You can have the best tools. You can have 100 vendors and they can all be sending you lots of great signals, but it really creates noise if you don't have a system that can explain it and can orchestrate it for you, right? And really put it into something that makes sense into your strategy. And that even goes right down to that. It ties into the continuous risk assessment, right? So think beyond the tactic and then move to how do you start to answer, even for your own organization, can you identify the person who logged in initially, if they deem to be low risk? Is it the same risk 20 minutes later? Is it the same risk 20 minutes later in a different channel? What does that look like to start to pull together that overarching view? And that's what RBA can really help you to do. So Warren, with that said, anything missing from this list that you say, hey, actually, what I think is incredibly important is adding this one to the list? Or do you have one that you would lean into more, even on the existing?
I think this is the right list. You overlay this with, informing the customer of the signals that you're picking up on, the risk assessment that you're picking up on throughout that journey. So letting them know, hey, this payment has a high risk of being a scam. Do you know where you're sending the money to? Are they a trusted party? Or, hey, the bank is actually not on the phone with you at the moment. So the person that you think you're speaking with who said they're from the bank is not truly from the bank. If you're picking up on these risk signals, if you're detecting it through your strategies and even making some decisions on that, inform your clients of that where you can, so they can kind of empower them to take security in their own hands, manage that device, manage that linked account, end that call that they're on, don't proceed with that payment, that type of thing.
That's fantastic advice, Warren. And also, we talked about this is hard, right? Like this could be hard to do. We are often asked, but wait, I have a SIAM platform. If I think, folks think of authentication, they say, I have a SIAM platform. How do I evolve my strategy? And my answer always is it's the power of both. right? So that you have your authentication provider that is important, but also, an identity decisioning platform, it can really help you from a risk-based standpoint. We talked a lot about how do you look at all of the different signals and pull them into a unified view, even across channels. And we also talked about, the evolution and how do you start to have different lines of business pull on to this strategy as well, and have different vendors where you can easily adapt and pull levers, and that the risk that you be maybe faced with tomorrow, you can adapt to. So, Warren, when I look at this, that's initially how I think about it, and how I answer it. What are you seeing in the adoption of this approach as well? And are you seeing it be effective in the industry?
I'm seeing it be effective. It's talked about quite a bit because it enables growth, it enables scale in an efficient manner. I think going back to what we were discussing a little earlier, Sarah, and those kind of three pillars here, bringing the underlying data together with the right monitoring metrics, the right visibility into that automated traffic, the good or bad that these areas are all picking up on. I think that's where, as we all mature in implementing these types of technologies, having the right ways of working and information sharing and understanding of what every area is seeing and managing is going to just help make this even more powerful to us.
Yeah, I agree, Warren. It's a journey, right? And we're seeing it, we're hearing it, but all on this journey together. Just keeping an eye on the time, I actually want to hop to our last slide here, which is, the business case. So we know that it can be hard, it can be lengthy. Warren laid out that these pieces can be challenging. And so when we have financial institutions say, I want to do it, where do I start? Or I have a few ideas on, the return and, from an ROI perspective, what should I be tracking? This is something that we look at. I certainly won't go through each one, but if you are looking to create that business case, feel free to take any of these on the list. We're seeing a lot of institutions that are using multiple, and Warren called it out. The product team, your business partners, working with fraud and your auth and technology, it's really the collaboration between the three that come to, oh, this is how we can have that growth lever. This is how we can move things forward. So really leaning in to your business partners. Warren, on this, when we look at it from a business case perspective, what have you found to be the most impactful? Because we know that this can be overwhelming, right? So suggestion on a place to start, easiest stats to obtain, what would you recommend?
Customer. At the end of the day, the product team, they generate the revenue. They also generate the risk. Often they have the larger investment dollars because they generate that revenue for the firm. So selling it on those points, influencing your product managers and lines of business to invest in authentication controls, in layers of security throughout their own strategic planning, their own product roadmap and development. That's how I found it to be more successful, especially when you're thinking about fraud and it's like, hey, I want to prevent a problem that I think is going to manifest 2 years from now. You might not have losses to go on in that moment. So spinning it on that customer is very valuable.
I think that's great, right? Customer always being at the forefront in what you're doing. And with that always being at the forefront, that can really help your case on deepening the relationship, how you can grow, how you can have them have additional trust, right? And really want to expand with you. Well, with that, Mike, I will turn it over to you to see if we have any questions from the audience.
Excellent. Yes, Sarah. Very good. We do have some good ones coming in here. let me lead off with this one. Building on the raising the bar slide, we know we can't apply RBA everywhere at once. If you had to pick 2 or 3 moments in the customer journey to start with, the highest impact, lowest disruption entry points, what would they be and why?
I'm happy to take that.
Go for it, Warren.
The moments that matter for the customer. So looking for potential red flags and notifying them or making sure those events are secured through risk-based authentication. So phone number being maybe the most important nowadays. Really, to do anything, you need access to a mobile phone or access to be able to get a text message, OTP, or something along those lines. So, prioritize based on like the moments that matter, maybe a phone change event, maybe a new account linkage or a new payee before money might leave the firm, that type of thing.
I think that's great advice. And I would say too, it also depends on where you are at in your journey, right? So if you think about where are you at, where are you seeing the most challenges, where do you have, maybe where you move faster from a technology perspective based on the technology in place. I think that can help to also inform your decision as well.
Excellent. Thank you both. And I think actually that brings us right about to the top of the hour. And we do always like to bring our programs in on time, knowing that so many folks are shifting to something else at the top of the hour. So first of all, Warren and Sarah, thank you so much for your time and expertise here today. Really appreciate it. Really dug into an important topic. So thank you for that. And of course, everyone in the audience, thank you for being here, for participating in those polls, and for asking those questions. We didn't get to everyone's questions, but as I said, we'll follow up afterward, and really do appreciate your time today. So with that, I will officially wrap it up. Wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day, and I hope you'll join us again here very soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.